surprised. I certainly thought Labour would have a far longer honeymoon period. I think there was a feeling of, whichever way you voted, that there was a need for change. But I think the thing that really hits me is that I remember when New Labour won, there was definitely a feeling of hope. There was a kind of a mission statement, and I think, from my point of view, certainly that seems to be missing. Whether there's a mission or not, we don't really know what the statement is. Am I right? Wrong?
I think that's certainly where most of the public are. So we know, as you say, spot on, people voted overwhelmingly for change. When you asked people during the election campaign, what are you voting for? They said change at the time. They say change in hindsight too. Labour cottoned onto that very effectively. Change was everywhere during their election campaign. On all the podiums and all the banners said change, that one word, which was very effective. It's exactly what people wanted. However, I think there were some warning signs for Labour, even amidst that result. So if you remember, Labour only got 33% of the vote, and that was on a 60% turnout, which means that only 20% of the eligible electorate actually cast a vote for the Labour Party. And views about Keir Starmer, they were just about in positive territory, but they were definitively lukewarm, I would say. So he was coming across better than all the Conservative politicians he was pitted against. That's probably not a
Not
surprise.
hard, though. Yeah.
No, what low bar, very
Yeah.
low bar at the time. But I think they hadn't done enough to positively sell his own brand or the party's brand before the election and anything else other than we are not those guys and we promise change. And the problem with that, I think, is twofold. Firstly, it means people's expectations for change are very high. So we did a poll the summer just after they were elected, which showed that 6 in 10 Labour voters expected to see change within less than a year. So that's a very, very high threshold they're putting on things already. And I think the second problem with that means that we know that the country is in this fractious place where they don't actually just want people to get on and govern behind the scenes. They're feeling a bit more restless than that. And we saw Rishi Sunak, a technocratic leader who didn't have very many political skills, think he could get away without having a sort of brand and a story to tell and a mission to bring people on board with other than just quietly fixing the mess that had come before him. And I think Keir Starmer's fallen prey to the same trap. But I would be so worried if I was in number 10 right now. Not so much, but I think you probably talk about the various models that have come out from my company included, as well as some other ones that point to a disastrous result for Labour if the election was tomorrow, losing more than 100 seats, more than 200 in one
But
case.
it's not, though, is it? I mean, the election's 5 years away,
No,
so we're not worrying
exactly.
about that.
We're not worrying about that, but what I would be worried about is what's happened to Keir Starmer's personal ratings and then
Yes.
questions about how the government are handling things. And I think, Liz Truss broke the scales for everyone a bit, really. And obviously she didn't make it this far. But Keir Starmer is doing historically badly for someone this only this long in office,
So
only
he's
6 months
he's
in
still ahead
office.
of Liz Truss, is he?
Well, only Liz Truss wasn't still here this amount of time on. So yes, he is doing better,
Yeah.
sort of by default. But he's doing extraordinarily badly. He's doing worse than Rishi Sunak at this point, worse than any prime
I, th-
minister
I think what's
at this
interesting
point.
is we did have a sort of series of characters as PMs, didn't we? And I think people just wanted less instability. They wanted a sort of steady hand on the till. And in a funny sense, Rishi Sunak almost did that, didn't he? Although it was too late for him by now because people didn't want the Tories and moved on. So maybe Starmer felt that that's all people wanted, and they didn't. They wanted more than that. We'd had the sort of steadiness for a bit, but it just wasn't working.
It wasn't working. We could see at the election result that people were voting for parties that weren't the main two parties or independent candidates at a rate we've never seen before. That has only accelerated since then, and I think will continue to accelerate further because people are looking for answers that the mainstream parties, they don't feel like the mainstream parties are giving them. And at the moment, I don't see that turning around anytime soon. I think it will take quite a lot for this government to turn things around. As you well pointed out, they've got the time. There's not going to be another election for at least another 4 years, or at least that's what everyone strongly thinks.
Yeah.
But they're going to need to do something pretty big, I think, to reset with the public, and they'll run out of opportunities to do so in some senses, big set piece opportunities. Because remember, we had Keir Starmer talk about his milestones after he talked about his missions. All of that, I actually think you get diminishing returns, and the public stops listening and starts looking in other places, which is, I think, is what's happening now. But we never know. Maybe they've used this break over Christmas as an opportunity for that big reset, and they'll come back in January and it'll be all guns blazing. But at the moment, I think it definitely looks a little bit bleak.
Do you think, I mean, the two things that seem to be the big things that people want sort of change on is probably the NHS and immigration. But do you think the real problem Labour have is, when I was talking about they didn't have an Alistair Campbell, one of the things I'd heard is there aren't actually a massive amount of people with proper journalistic experience in the current government. Do you think that's fair? Were they trying not? Do you think being sort of good spinners has become a bit toxic for Labour and they're trying to do the opposite of that?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think there's definitely a potential where the public, in some ways, are fed up. It's one of those sort of impossible binds, of sort of catch-22. Really, they're fed up of being spun to, and that's
Yeah.
one of the first things they'll say.
But then
It's
no
like,
one gets the message.
right, exactly. But I think if you're a politician, it's dangerous to take that too literally and to think that means you don't need people selling your mission when you
Yeah.
absolutely do. And especially when actually, there's a lot to criticise about three-word slogans. If you say, they lose the nuance and all the rest of it, but you're going to need something that's more digestible than the milestones, missions, foundations, that sort of, and how they interact with each other and all of that. That is not very sellable to people. And you're right, people's priorities are the health service, immigration, and the economy. So they're sort of in the right ballpark. But at the moment, I think people don't have a clear sense of, yes, they know that they're saying change will happen, but I think at the moment the public don't know how this government's planning to get there, and I think that's still what's missing.
Do you think there's just a general feeling of gloom? What was the expression there? A pervasive sense of national gloom has set upon us. Is that a pervasive sense of gloom UK based, or is that sort of more global? I mean, things like climate change, the fact that the world seems to be heating up, war-wise in so many places. Do you think it's just it's sort of unlucky darts, really, in the timing, or is it
We
something to do
have.
with Labour?
We have seen a malaise that looks quite global, at least in developed Western democracies such as ours, after COVID. So all these economies that have struggled to recover from the sort of long tail of COVID and the damage that's done in terms of inflation, in terms of cost of living, coupled with anxieties, which you see replicated again across countries about immigration. And you'll see it's happening in countries everywhere. So we've seen, obviously, the elections in America. We've seen Germany, which is going to have its elections in February, the French government, which collapsed in record time. We are not unique for having a population which is feeling like things aren't working and is looking for different answers and is feeling gloomy, as you say, and pessimistic and like things are moving direction. So you're absolutely right. It's not unique to Britain. I think the problem is that whilst that's not unique, politicians in each country are going to have to try and come up with solutions that work for each of these countries, which do have different economies, different models of public services, different relationships with and reliance on immigration, all these things, different health services, different ways of funding them. And again, I think that's what people think is missing. And I think it's quite interesting because people's bandwidth is very different. And I think one of the reasons why you're seeing the rise of reform, which
Yeah.
is inescapable, whichever way you look at it, the trend lines are moving in the right direction for reform and in the wrong direction for pretty much everyone else. And I think it's because they're sort of the message they are mounting is, you wanted change, you've tried the Labour Party, now they're not real change, we are real change. And it's interesting because as pollsters we've seen that message mounted effectively from other parties. The Green Party used it very effectively in Bristol, for example, at this election, saying Labour Party won't be real change, we are, we look different, we're actually change. And I think that's something you're going to see pick up more and more pace, as it has done in these other countries too.
Yes, it's just it's that feeling of they're all the same. And so really voting between two different political parties, you just get a different, person,
That's
the same
exactly
thing.
it.
And so they're looking
Yeah.
for a sort of a more radical shift to something
Yeah,
completely different.
I think that's exactly it. They're all the same, and crucially, there's a record low trust in these politicians, which they view as all the same. And I think this is the real problem for Keir Starmer, and why I spoke at the beginning about them not doing enough to build his story, his brand before the election. I mean, obviously, his son of a toolmaker, all the rest of it. But they
Yeah.
didn't do enough to sell him as someone that was actually going to be more than just not a Tory. And people were already saying, he wasn't a terribly popular leader of the opposition. He was more popular than Kenny Badenoch, which is a separate point
Yeah.
at this point in his time. But the people were always saying, I think he might just be another man in a suit. I think he might just be another politician that goes back on what he says, which is why some of the things that Labour have now done also become more damaging for them. Things like winter fuel payment, things like the farming tax hours. There's the sneaking suspicion people have that politicians go back on their word, that Keir Starmer goes back on his word, and therefore he's just another politician that they don't like. And so there's going to have to be a lot done to counteract it. I thought it was interesting that this time last year we were seeing Keir Starmer out of a suit. We were seeing him in sort of normal slacks. Because
Well,
I think all of that was trying to
slacks,
do that. Yeah, exactly. Well,
Yeah.
it's not for me to comment on men's
Chinos.
fashion. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I think all of that was trying to comment, I'm not like the rest of them. But the
Yeah.
problem is it didn't
It's
go
too
far
late.
enough. I think it was too superficial and too late.
It's interesting because when you look at Tories and, looking at the sort of same old, people always go back to, we want Boris back. Is there a kind of Labour equivalent to that? Is Starmer safe from rivals?
That's fascinating. I mean, I think people have already got upset at figures like Wes Streeting, who they think look like he might want the job a bit too much.
Yeah.
I think, as far as the public's concerned, there's no obvious successor, which is good for Keir Starmer.
Yeah, there's no
That's
Boris
a very
in
good
the
position
wings.
to be in.
Sort of
There's
a red,
no Boris
red
in the
Boris.
wings. Exactly. And I think one of the reasons why Rishi Sunak hang on, and obviously wasn't a very long time really before the election, but why there wasn't a leadership challenge when things looked terminal for the Conservatives, actually the result wasn't as bad as some people were expecting, even though it was catastrophic for them, was because, again, with Boris out of Parliament, there was no obvious successor. And I think Keir Starmer's in a slightly similar boat. It's harder to depose of a Labour leader anyway, but also there is no one else obvious that I think people would say, yes, they're the answer now. So I think that helps him. But I do think it's extraordinary that you might just say it's journalists running away with themselves. I'm sure that is it. But it's extraordinary that you're even seeing conversations about leadership challenges in the press.
It's astonishing.
At this point.
I mean, it's
astonishing.
6 months in after a massive win, and here I am, and we all are doing it. And it is absolutely extraordinary. And are we guilty?